"She will not come," said Lady Marchmont, snapping her fan shut. "Not tonight, not in this house. The creature has not the face for it." The Duke of Wolverton, who had spent the last 12 months and something over £9,000 making certain that she could, set down his glass on a footman's tray and said nothing at all. It was the same ballroom. That was Lady Marchmont's doing, and he had known it would be, and he had come anyway. 800 candles in the same 4 chandeliers, the same painted ceiling of unconvincing gods, the same doorway at the top of the same 6 steps where, a year ago in June, he had stood in front of 40 people and destroyed the only good thing that had ever happened to him. He remembered every word of it, because he had written it out beforehand in his study 3 times, choosing the coldest version. Miss Prentice appears to have mistaken civility for intention. I have made her no offer, I shall make her none, and I would be obliged if the subject were not raised again in my hearing. He remembered the sound of it landing. He remembered that she had not made a scene, that she had gone white to the hairline, and looked at him for perhaps 2 seconds with an expression he still saw most nights at about 3 in the morning, and then had thanked her hostess for a delightful evening, and walked out of the room at the pace of a woman who has all the time in the world. He had gone home and been sick. 4 hours before that, in the library of his own house, a man named Sir Crispin Vale had laid 3 documents on the table in front of him, and had explained, with great good humor, what he held. Aloin Prentice's mother had married a second time in a chapel at Lisbon, in the middle of a war, and there was a question. Vale said the word question as another man might crack a whip. A question whether the first husband had been living at the date. There was a paper that said he had. If that paper were published, then the marriage was no marriage. And if the marriage were no marriage, then the young woman who taught the pianoforte at Nether Cardew for 11 shillings a week was nobody at all, with no name to give and none to take, and every door in England would shut on her in a week and never open again. Publish it then, Wolverton had said. "Oh, I have no wish to publish it," Vale had smiled. "I have a daughter, your grace, 24, tolerably handsome, 11,000 a year of her own. Attach yourself where it does you credit, and this dull paper stays in my desk, and Miss Prentice goes on giving her music lessons undisturbed." A pause. "Whereas if the Duke of Wolverton is understood to be in love with the girl, well, then she becomes interesting. Then people look her up. I should not be able to prevent them." Wolverton had stood at his own window for 2 hours after the man left. He could have gone to her. He had thought of it every hour of the 12 months since. He could have told her the whole thing, and she would have taken his arm and married him inside the month, and let the world do its worst. He had known her well enough by then to be certain of it. And Vale would have published within a week, because Vale's entire object was to make the connection intolerable, and she would have spent the next 40 years being pointed out in every room she entered, and any child of theirs with her, and it would have been his doing and could never be undone. So he had gone to the Marchmont ball with 3 sentences written out in his pocket, and he had cut her publicly, and coldly, in a manner nobody could mistake for anything but the end. And Sir Crispin Vale, watching from beside the orchestra, had inclined his head to him like a man acknowledging a good stroke at billiards. Then Wolverton had gone to work. It took 11 months. He did not use his own name. He sent a clerk to Lisbon, and when the clerk came back with nothing he went himself, in November, in a packet-boat that lost its foretopmast, and he sat for 19 days in a consular office in a language he did not speak. The first husband, it emerged, had been a purser in the merchant service, and had gone out to the Brazils, and Vale's paper a bill of lading with his name signed to it, dated 8 months after the Lisbon wedding, was perfectly genuine and perfectly worthless, because the signature was his brother's. There were two of them. The same name, the same trade, the same ship's owners. The purser himself had died of a fever at Bahia 19 months before Alohan's mother ever set foot in that chapel, and it was written down in a burial register, in a stone church above a harbor, in a hand so small that Wolverton had had to have a glass fetched to read his own salvation. He brought home the register entry attested by a consul, 2 depositions from men who had helped bury him, and the brother's own account, taken at Bristol, signed with a cross. The marriage was good. It had always been good. Alohan Prentice was, and had always been, exactly who she had believed herself to be. And rather more than that, since the mother's family, once the thing was proved beyond any lawyer's power to quibble, could no longer pretend that the connection did not exist. That last part was not the Duke's doing, and he was glad of it. That was her aunt. Lady Rosalind Aumery had not spoken her sister's name for 22 years, on the grounds of the Lisbon marriage, and when the papers were laid before her in April by a strange duke who refused to sit down, she read them all through twice, and then said, in a voice like a gate opening, "Then I have had a niece for 23 years, and I have been the greatest fool in England." "Not the greatest, madam," said Wolverton. "I hold that title, and I shall not give it up." As for Sir Crispin Vale, he had gone bail for a friend's speculation in March, and the speculation had failed, and he had removed to Boulogne in May and was not expected back. Wolverton had had nothing to do with that either. He had merely declined, when asked, to lend him £4,000. So the Duke of Wolverton stood in the Marchmont ballroom on a June night with the papers a year old and his 3 sentences a year old, and understood that he had done every part of it except the only part that mattered, which was to be forgiven, and that he had no right whatever to expect it. He had written to her every week for a year, on Sunday evenings, 1 sheet, and every letter had gone into a japanned box in his study instead of the post, because, until the register was found, there was nothing he could tell her that would not have put her in the fire. 52 letters. He had them with him tonight in the box in his carriage, which was the act of a lunatic, and he was aware of it. At 11:30 the double doors at the top of the 6 steps opened. "The Countess of Aumery," said the man at the door. "Miss Alohan Prentice." The Duke of Wolverton had heard a room go quiet before. He had never heard 800 candles' worth of London go out like a snuffed wick. It was not the gown, though the gown was very fine and had been chosen by a woman with 11,000 a year and a point to make. It was not even the Countess of Aumery on her right hand, in diamonds, holding her arm in the manner of a lioness with 1 cub and a grievance. It was that Alohan came down the 6 steps without hurrying and without looking at anybody, and stopped at the bottom, and let them all have a good long look at her, and the whispering did not resume. Lady Marchmont's fan hung open in her hand like something forgotten. 200 people who had spent a year saying the Prentice girl in a particular tone discovered, at the same instant, that they had been saying it about the Countess of Aumery's own niece, whom they were now going to have to be introduced to. Wolverton did not move. He could not for a moment. She had grown thinner. There was a line at the corner of her mouth that had not been there in June, and he had put it there. She was 23 years old, and she was standing at the foot of those steps in the room where he had ruined her, entirely alone inside a crowd, and holding her ground. He had never in his life admired anything so much, or felt so entirely unfit to be in the same building. He was halfway across the floor before he had decided to cross it. People got out of his way. They always did. And Alohan Prentice watched him come the whole distance with her chin level and her eyes absolutely steady. "Miss Prentice." "Your Grace." Will you dance with me? No, said Aloan. The room heard it. He had known it would. She had made no effort to lower her voice, and he thought, with something that was almost joy in it, that a year ago she would have whispered. Then may I fetch you a glass of something? No, I thank you. Will you allow me 5 minutes in the small library? No. Very well, he bowed. Then I shall say it here and briefly and go. I have no explanation that will do you any good tonight. I have something better and I would rather put it into your hands than talk about it. Your aunt has seen the whole of it. Ask her, and she will tell you that I have not exaggerated by a syllable, which is more than I can prove myself. He straightened. And I beg your pardon, not for a misunderstanding. For a cruelty, deliberately committed in this room, in front of these people. I have had a year to find a smaller word for it, and there is not one. Aloan Prentice's hand tightened on her aunt's arm until the glove wrinkled. You are asking me to be moved, she said, in a ballroom where everyone can watch. No, madam, I am asking you nothing at all. I ended it in public. It seemed to me the apology had no business being made in a corner. He glanced once at the 200 faces. You may cut me now. It would be entirely just, and I shall not flinch, and it will do you a great deal of good with these people. And Aloan Prentice looked at him for a long moment, the same 2 seconds he had been seeing at 3 in the morning for a year, and said, How very like you, to arrange even that. Then she turned her shoulder to the Duke of Wolverton and walked away into the crowd, and the crowd let her through as though she were made of glass. He did not follow her. He went out to his carriage and fetched the japanned box and gave it to the Countess of Aumery in the card-room, with a request that it be handed to her niece at whatever hour her niece would take it, or burned unopened, whichever was preferred. What is in it? Said the Countess. 52 letters, madam, none of them sent. Good heavens! She weighed the box in both hands. And what do they say? I could not tell you. I have never once read one back. Wolverton took up his hat. They were written on Sunday evenings for a year by a man who could not speak to her and had nowhere else to put it. I imagine a good many of them are extremely dull. He was in the hall when Lady Marchmont intercepted him, all teeth and sympathy, wanting to know whether it was true about the Aumery connection, and was it not extraordinary, and had he known? I knew, said the Duke of Wolverton. And you said nothing. For a whole year, while everyone, she stopped, having got a good way further into the sentence than was safe. While everyone said what you said tonight before I came in. Yes. He put on his hat, which was not done indoors, and did it anyway. You may repeat that to anybody you like. I find, madam, that after the year I have had, I am no longer at all interested in being thought well of in this house. He heard from her on the Tuesday. It was not a letter. It was a card in a hand he would have known anywhere. He had 211 pages of it from before in a drawer, and it said only, The Pump Room at Cardew, Thursday, 11 o'clock. Bring nothing. He was there at 9:30, and walked up and down the colonnade for an hour and a half like a man waiting for a verdict, which he was. She came at 11 exactly, in a plain straw bonnet, with the japanned box under her arm. You will walk with me, said Aloan Prentice. Not sit. I cannot look at you and say this at the same time. They walked. The gravel was wet. There had been rain in the night. She held the box against her side with both arms as though it were a good deal heavier than it was. I have read them all, she said. Twice. I sat up 2 nights. A pause. You wrote to me every Sunday for a year and told me about drainage and a lame horse and a bad sermon. And the 9th of November, when the boat lost its mast, and you wrote a letter you clearly believed was the last one you would ever write, and you spent the whole of it apologizing for the way you had spoken to me in that ballroom, and not one word of it explaining why, because you still could not risk the paper being read. Her voice went thin. There is a letter in there in Portuguese ink, where the hand shakes so badly I could not make out 4 lines together. That was the day of the register. I know you wrote it in the church. She stopped walking and turned and looked up at him with her eyes swimming. Tristan, I am so angry with you that I can hardly breathe. Yes. You decided. You sat in your library and you weighed my whole life on a pair of scales, and you never once, not once, did me the honor of telling me the price and letting me choose to pay it. I would have paid it. I would have stood up in that church with you in front of anybody, and if they had published every word of it, I would have taught the pianoforte in Bath as your Grace's wife and been happier than I have been for 1 single hour of this year. Her hands were shaking on the box. You call it protection. I know exactly what it was. It was the only thing in the world you were afraid of, that you might have to watch it hurt me, and you spared yourself and called it sparing me, and it cost me my name and my hope and my mother's memory for 12 months. And then you brought all 3 back in a box and asked to be forgiven for it. And the very worst of it, the very worst, is that you were right about Vale. The Duke of Wolverton stood on the wet gravel and took the whole of it, and did not defend one word. That is all true, he said. I would like to say only one thing, and it is not an excuse. Say it. You are entirely correct that I was afraid, and if it happened again tomorrow, knowing what it cost, knowing your face at the bottom of those steps, I hope to God I should have the sense to do as you say and put it in your hands. But I am not certain that I should. I'm a man who has been obeyed since he was 19 years old, and I have almost no practice at being helped. He met her eyes. That is my great fault, Eloan. You have found it in a year. Nobody else has found it in 38. If you take me, you will be marrying a man who will want to carry things alone, and who will have to be stopped, and stopped again, and told the truth in a pump room in the rain. Eloan Prentice began, terribly, to cry. I am not going to say yes today, she said. No, I have not asked. You will not ask for a long while. I shall wait for as long as you require, and then some months beyond it for the good of my character. And you will call on my aunt, who is a dragon, and you will let her be uncivil to you for at least a season, because she has 22 years of being wrong to work off on somebody, and she will not do it on me. Madam, said the Duke of Wolverton, I shall take tea with your aunt every Wednesday until one of us dies. She laughed. It came out ruined and wet and half a sob, and she put the box down on the balustrade and put her hands over her face, and he stood there with his own hands at his sides and did not touch her, because it was not yet his to do. And then she reached out, without uncovering her face, and took hold of his sleeve and held it. They were married the following June, at Nether Cardew, in the small parish church where she had taught the pianoforte for 11 shillings a week. She would not have London. She would not have the Marchmont set, though a great many of them wrote. The invitations went to the organist, the sexton, 9 families whose daughters she had taught, the Countess of Aumery in diamonds at 10 in the morning, and a purser's brother from Bristol, who could not write his name and who was given the seat of honor and a new coat, and wept through the service without knowing quite why he was there. Wolverton had the burial register entry copied out fair and framed, and hung in the passage at Wolverton where his wife would pass it every day. And the first thing she did, on her first morning as its mistress, was to take it down. Not in the passage, she said. In your study, please, where you sat and decided things alone. It hung there for the rest of his life, and under it on the same wall the japanned box, and it was a settled joke in that house, a joke with a good deal of iron in the middle of it. That when the Duke of Wolverton was found sitting in his study looking at the wall, the Duchess was sent for at once, whatever she was doing, by whichever servant found him. She always came. She came for 41 years. She came the night of the bank failure, and the night his brother's letter arrived from India, and the wet October evening when the roof of the almshouse went, and he had convinced himself in a quarter of an hour that he must sell the Cardew Farms and tell nobody. And every time she came in and shut the door and sat down opposite him, and said the same 4 words, which had been the first 4 words of the 52nd letter in the box. "Tell me the price." And every time, in the end, he told her, and it was never once as heavy as it had been when he was carrying it by himself.